126 piers of rock and squared timber once stood in the Penobscot River above Old Town, Maine, and between them ran miles of spruce logs chained end to end into a single floating fence. In one season, that fence was rigged with 80 tons of rope. Behind it, in the biggest years, more than 200 million board feet of pine and spruce came down the river in the spring flood and stacked against the timber, and not one log of it was allowed past until a man standing out on the water had read the owner's mark hammered into the end. This was the Penobscot boom. It was built of nothing but wood, iron, stone, and moving river. It had no engine in it anywhere, and for the better part of a century, it decided which logs reached the sawmills and which ones vanished downriver for good. The man who first talked the state of Maine into building it was a Bangor lumber baron named Rufus Dwinelle. But here is the part that stops me every time. Nothing about that structure was permanent. The ice tore it apart nearly every winter, and every spring a crew rebuilt it by hand before the logs came down. I want to show you how they built a machine that could hold an entire river of timber, how they anchored it against a flood, and how a boy of 12, standing on a rolling log over cold deep water, could sort one company's logs from another's at a glance, 10 hours a day. This is not the story of the log drive. It is the story of the thing waiting at the bottom of the drive, the thing that made the whole trade possible, and almost nobody remembers it was ever there. Dwinelle understood a problem that hardly anyone thinks about when they picture old-time logging. Everyone pictures the axe and the falling pine. Almost nobody pictures what happens after. Every winter, dozens of separate companies cut timber all through the North Maine woods, and every spring, all of it went into the same river at the same time, in the same flood. Hundreds of thousands of logs, from dozens of different owners, mixed together in one roaring mass of water and wood, and every single log belonged to somebody. The whole of the Bangor lumber trade, the richest in the world at the time, ran on one task that sounds impossible when you say it out loud. Somebody had to pull that mixed flood apart, log by log, and give every stick of it back to the man who had paid to cut it. And they had to do it fast. The logs would waterlog and sink if they sat too long, and the summer would drop the river too low to move anything at all. A fortune in timber arrived all at once, tangled and anonymous, and there was only a short window to turn that chaos back into orderly, owned, countable property. Miss the window, and the logs you could not sort became the logs you simply lost. The tool for that job was the boom. In the 1820s, crews strung the first great boom across the river north of Old Town, and in 1832, the state of Maine chartered Dwinelle's company, the Penobscot Boom Corporation, to build it out and run it. The charter gave the company the right to throw a barrier clear across the Stillwater branch of the Penobscot and to plant piers and side booms wherever the work required them. Whoever held that boom held the key to the entire river. Every log that came down the Penobscot had to pass through it, and every owner had to pay to get his own timber back out of it. That made the boom one of the most valuable single pieces of property on the whole river, and for years the right to run it was fought over hard, because the company that held the boom sat astride the one gate every log had to pass. Holding it was like holding the only bridge into a walled city. Everyone with timber on the river had to cross, and everyone had to pay. Dwinelle did not hold it for long. In 1833, he sold the works to a hard-driving general named Samuel Vesey, one of the biggest lumbermen in the state. Vesey looked at the boom's first home, at a place on the river called Pea Cove, and decided it could not handle the volume that was coming. So in the winter of 1836 and 1837, he moved the whole operation downriver and built a far larger boom at Argyle, on a stretch of the Penobscot between an island called White Squaw and the western bank. Argyle became the heart of the thing. For roughly the next 90 years, it was the chief sorting, rafting, and scaling boom on the river, the place where the entire cut of the Penobscot watershed was caught, read, and handed back to its owners. There was a reason all of this sat on the river just above Old Town. The sawmills that turned logs into boards were clustered on the falls at Old Town and just below, at Orono and Stillwater and Great Works, where the drop in the river gave them their water power. Everything cut in the entire northern watershed had to come down to that stretch to be milled, which made the water just above the mills the one place where the whole river's timber was guaranteed to pass in a single channel. Catch the logs there, and you caught all of them. It was the natural throat of the entire trade, and the boom was built straight across it. So let me start with the marks, because nothing else about the boom makes sense without them. A log floating in a river carries no label and no paperwork. The only thing that told one company's timber from another's was a private mark, a small pattern of axe cuts hammered into the end of every single log up in the winter woods, the way a rancher brands cattle. On the Penobscot, more than 200 of these marks were registered, each one belonging to a single owner, each one a different little combination of cuts and notches that could still be read after a log had ground its way 100 miles downriver. The men who worked the boom called them dog tracks. These were not casual scratches in the wood. A log mark was registered property, filed with the authorities and protected at law, and altering one was treated as a kind of forgery, because forging a mark was a way to steal a standing tree. Some owners used a simple line and a single notch. Others built up a whole small signature of hacks and crow's feet and slashes, distinctive enough that a trained eye could pick it out from all the others in the half-second it took a log to drift past. A log with a clear mark was money in the bank. A log whose mark had been battered off in the drive was a log that nobody could legally claim, and it went to a separate account for the strays. That is the entire problem the boom existed to solve. 200 marks, dozens of owners, one flood, and a rule that every man got back exactly the timber he had paid to cut, and not one stick more. Get it wrong, and you have handed one company's fortune to another. The boom was the machine that got it right, and it got it right by hand, on moving water, in the cold, year after year for decades. And before it could sort a single log, it had to hold the river. So that is where the real engineering starts, out on the ice, in the dead of winter, months before the first log came down. The boom was anchored to the riverbed by more than 100 artificial islands, and the men built every one of them in the coldest part of the year, standing on the frozen river. There were 126 of these piers along the Argyle works. Each one was a crib, a great open box framed out of heavy timber, and the crews built them out on the ice in January and February, when the river was frozen thick enough to carry the weight of the work. They framed the crib on top of the ice. Then they filled it with rock, hauling stone out across the frozen river on sleds, and stacking it inside the timber box until the load grew enormous. And then they cut the ice out from underneath the whole thing, and the crib and its cargo of stone dropped straight down and settled onto the river bottom. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. If the pier came up short of the surface, they simply framed another crib on top of the first one, filled it with more stone, and let it sink again, and they kept at it until the island of rock and timber broke the surface exactly where they wanted it. The upstream face of each pier was built on a slant, angled to meet the current and the spring ice and turn it aside instead of taking the blow head-on, because the same river that carried the logs also carried ice heavy enough to crush a green pier flat. Alongside the cribs, they drove long spruce pilings deep into the riverbed with a drop hammer worked from the water. All of those piers were built by hand out on the ice, and a great many of them were damaged and rebuilt every single spring, because the river never once stopped trying to take them apart. Think for a moment about what building even one of those piers actually took. The stone did not come from the riverbed. It was quarried on shore and dragged out onto the ice on sleds, hauled by teams of oxen and horses across a frozen river, then lifted into the timber crib by hand with block and tackle, one heavy load at a time, in the coldest weeks of a Maine winter. When the crib was loaded, the crews cut the supporting ice out from under it, and a box of rock weighing many tons dropped through the hole they had opened and slammed down onto the river bottom. It was cold, deliberate, dangerous work, done standing on a surface that was itself only a few feet of ice over deep, moving, freezing water. They did it more than 100 times to lay out the Argyle works. Then they went back and did it again, wherever the ice had wrecked a pier the spring before. With the pier standing, the crew strung the boom itself, and this was the part that gave the whole structure its name. They took the longest, soundest logs they had and chained them together end to end, log to log, into a continuous floating line that ran from pier to pier across the water. The links were heavy iron. In the end of each log they bored a hole a couple of inches across and most of a foot deep, and through it They ran a thick iron pin with a head on it, locking the log to a short heavy chain, and the chain to the next log. A single boom string could run more than 1,000 feet, a floating fence of timber long enough to close off the river, and it took miles of that chained boom to build out the full works. Every spring the men hung it fresh, and holding it all together took rope on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture. In one season, the boom crew rigged the works with 80 tons of cordage, all of it strung by hand, just to hold a river in place. Not all of the booms did the same job, and this is where the design gets clever. Some of them were sheer booms, set at an angle across the current, so that the running logs, instead of piling straight into them, were shunted sideways, steered by the slant of the timber, the way a plow throws snow off to the side of a road. A sheer boom could take the whole force of the river's flood and turn it, bleeding the logs out of the fast water and into the quiet holding grounds behind the piers, where the sorting could actually happen. Others were trip booms and sorting booms, shorter sections that could be opened and closed to let a run of logs through a gap and then seal it again. Set all of it together, string after string across a 10-mile stretch of river, and you had a single apparatus, run entirely on current, chain, and rope, that could take an entire forest coming down in flood and bring it to a controlled stop. Now for the work the boom was really built for, which was the sort. When the flood brought the winter's cut down to Argyle, the whole mixed mass of it was steered by the sheer booms into the holding grounds, and there it waited. Acres of floating logs, packed gunwale to gunwale, every one carrying a different owner's mark. And then men walked out onto it. They were called checkers, and what they did still amazes me. A checker went out onto the floating logs themselves, out over open water, and moved from log to log reading the mark cut into the end of each one. Some of them worked holding onto a line stretched across the water for balance. Some worked from small rafts anchored in the current. Either way, the job was the same. Look at the dog track, cut into a log, know instantly which of more than 200 owners it belonged to, and shunt that log toward the right gap so it drifted into that owner's pocket and no one else's. Log after log after log, 10 and 12 hours a day, through the entire run of the drive. A man who could read every mark on the river at a glance was worth nearly as much as anyone on the works, and the company kept every one of those marks recorded in a registered book. It never kept the name of the checker who could read them. The sorting itself happened at the gaps. All along the holding grounds, the booms were arranged so that each owner, or each set of owners bound for the same mill, had a pocket, a section of penned water that belonged to their timber alone. Between the open water and the pockets were the sorting gaps, narrow openings that a single log could be steered through. So the checker did far more than read the mark. He also had to shove each log with a pike pole at exactly the right instant, sending it gliding through the correct gap and into the correct pocket, while the current kept pushing 100 more logs down onto him. Read, decide, shunt, and step to the next log, over and over, with the whole river feeding the line. Once a man found the rhythm of it, the work looked almost easy from the bank. A single slip put him straight into the water, underneath the moving logs. And a surprising number of the hands doing this were children. In the early 1900s, of the 200 to 250 people working the Argyle boom, perhaps a third of them were boys between the ages of 10 and 14. They were out there because they were light on their feet, quick, and completely at home on the moving logs, and because they were cheap to hire. A boy who grew up along the Penobscot could run across floating timber almost before he could do anything else, and the boom put that skill straight to work. Picture that for a moment. A 12-year-old, out on the open river in the spring, stepping from one rolling log to the next above cold, deep water, sorting a lumber baron's fortune by the little marks on the ends, and treating it as an ordinary summer job. That was the Argyle boom on a normal morning. There is something in that picture that I cannot quite get over. The most valuable and most exacting single step in the entire lumber trade of the world's greatest lumber port, the step where a baron's fortune was pulled apart and assigned, was handed in large part to boys who were not yet old enough to shave. And it worked. The record does not show the trade collapsing because the sort went wrong. It shows the timber going through cleanly, season after season. Those boys and the men working beside them were, in their quiet and completely unglamorous way, some of the most reliable sorting machinery this country ever built. And every piece of it was a kid in wet boots with a pike pole in his hands. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. Sorting the logs was only half of the job. Once a checker had shunted a batch of one owner's timber into his pocket, that timber had to be bound up and made ready to travel the last few miles down to the mills, and that was its own craft. The boom men gathered the sorted logs into small rafts they called joints. To hold a joint together, they did not use nails or spikes. They ran a light rope around the logs and locked it with wooden wedges, crotched pieces of hardwood driven in to bite and hold, so the whole raft could be built and taken apart quickly by hand. Then the joints were coupled into long strings called swings, and the swings were strung together with heavy hawser into tows big enough to send down the river behind a steamboat. Twice a day, steamers came up to the boom, and men the crews called runners made up the new swings according to who had bought what. Because that is the other thing the boom was. It was not only a sorting yard, it was the counting house of the entire river. Every log that passed through was measured by a scaler, a man whose whole trade was estimating how many board feet of finished lumber a round log would yield. He read the length of the log and the diameter of its small end, ran it against a scaling rule he carried in his head and in his hands, and called out a number, and that number was the log. A good scaler could size a stick in seconds, and be trusted by the buyer and the seller alike to be fair, which is a rare thing for any one man to be. Every operator on the Penobscot paid the driving company a fee for every board foot of his timber that came through the boom that season, so the scalers called out numbers were, quite literally, the bills. The sort decided who owned each log, and the scale decided what that log was worth and what its owner owed. Nothing left the Penobscot without crossing that ledger, and the ledger was kept out on the water, in the middle of the river, by men balancing on the logs. The whole operation ran on the calendar of the river. The boom sat idle and frozen all winter, while the crews rebuilt what the ice had broken. Then, at ice out in the spring, the works opened, and from that moment the boom ran without a real pause until the final log of the year had been sorted out of the river, which might not happen until the fall. Through all of it, the steamers came up twice a day, the runners made up the swings, the scalers called their numbers, and the checkers read their marks, morning to night, for months on end. It was seasonal work that ran flat out for the whole season it lasted. None of this was safe, and none of it was still. The boom was busiest at the exact moment the river was highest and coldest, in the spring flood, when the whole winter's cut arrived at once. At the peak of the drive, the Argyle Works put hundreds of men on the water at the same time. On one August drive in the 1880s, the boom employed 425 men, and that was on top of all the boys. Every one of them spent the day on wet, rolling, shifting logs, over water cold enough and deep enough to kill, with the timber packed so tight underfoot that a slip did not drop a man into open water. It dropped him under a moving ceiling of logs. The men worked with pike poles and heavy hooked bars, prying and steering, and the logs answered slowly and then all at once. A waterlogged log the size of a telephone pole does not stop or turn on command. A man leaned his whole weight on the bar and nothing moved, and he leaned harder, and then the log broke loose and rolled, and the trick that kept him alive was knowing, before it happened, which way it would go, and where his own feet would be when it did. The boom men learned that the way you learn anything that can kill you, by watching the ones who already knew it, and by being lucky long enough to get good. And the greatest enemy of the boom was not any single flood, it was the ice, and it came back every year. When the river froze and then broke up in the spring, the ice ran downstream in slabs and flows with enough force to shear off the pilings and stave in the cribs, and it went at the piers season after season, so the work of the boom was never actually finished. Every winter the ice damaged the structure, and every spring, before the first logs came down, the crews were back out on the river, repairing the piers, rebuilding what the ice had taken, and restringing the booms, so the machine would be whole and waiting when the flood arrived. The boom a visitor saw floating there in June had been partly rebuilt by hand that very spring. In truth, it was never a permanent structure at all. The men recreated it every year, out of the same rock and timber and iron, against the same river that spent every winter tearing it down. It is worth stopping to feel the scale of what this one stretch of river was handling. In the biggest years of the Bangor trade, the amount of timber that came down the Penobscot in a single season and squeezed through these booms is genuinely hard to believe. Every stick of it was caught, held, read, sorted, scaled, rafted, and sent on by hand. All of that pine and spruce fed the sawmills clustered just below, at Old Town, at Orono, at Stillwater, at Great Works. Mills that turned the river's timber into finished boards and shipped them out through Bangor to build cities all over the country and far beyond it. For a stretch of the 1800s, on the strength of exactly this, Bangor was the greatest lumber shipping port in the world. And the choke point the entire trade squeezed through, the one piece of the whole system that every single log had to cross, was a wooden fence in the river held up by rock cribs and miles of chained timber. 200 million board feet is a number that slides right off the mind, so let me try to make it land. A board foot is a plank a foot square and an inch thick. Line up 200 million of them end to end, and they would reach around the entire earth and then a good way around it a second time. Enough finished lumber came through this one bend of the Penobscot in a single strong season to build a small city of houses. And it did not trickle in over years. It came through in the few months between ice out and freeze up. All of it caught and read and counted by men and boys balancing on the water. That was one season. The boom did it again the next year, and the year after that, decade after decade. There is a detail in how the money worked that tells you how exact the sort had to be. Because a log with a battered, unreadable mark could not be given back to its owner, those strays were pulled aside and handled on their own separate account, and no company wanted its timber ending up in that pile. So the pressure on the checkers ran in one direction only, toward getting it right. A log sent to the wrong pocket meant one company had paid to cut timber that a different company carried off to its mill. A log left unread was money that simply fell out of the system. The entire trade trusted a line of men and boys balancing on the logs to keep those mistakes down to almost nothing, across every registered mark and that whole flood of timber, and by every account that comes down to us, they did exactly that. At the end of the season, the books were squared. Each operator was billed for the board feet the scalers had credited to his mark. The strays were sold off on their own account, and the whole tangled flood of the spring resolved, on paper, into clean columns of owned and paid-for timber. Then the river froze, the boom came down, and the crews got ready to build the entire thing again. So picture the whole thing working at once, at the height of the drive. The river is in flood, brown and fast, and full of ice-cold snowmelt. Around the bend comes the front of the season's cut, and it does not stop coming. Hundreds of thousands of logs, from dozens of different owners, all mixed together, driving down on the current in a mass that stretches back up the river and out of sight. It reaches the sheer booms, and the angled timber turns it, bleeding the force off to the side, easing the flood out of the main channel and into the holding grounds behind the piers. The chained booms take the weight and hold. The logs stack up against the timber. Acres of them, gunwale to gunwale, a floor of wood you could nearly walk across to the far bank. And then the men and the boys go out onto it, and the sort begins, and it does not end until the last log of the season has been read and sent to its owner, sometimes not until the fall. 126 piers, miles of chained logs, 80 tons of rope, more than 200 registered marks, and a whole river's fortune in timber pulled apart and handed back, one log at a time, by hand. None of it survives the way you might hope. The long log trade that built the boom eventually gave out, and the drives that fed it wound down through the 20th century, until the last log drive in the entire state of Maine came down the west branch of the Penobscot in 1971. After that, the booms had nothing left to catch. The chained timbers were pulled, the rope rotted or was carried off, and the great sorting grounds at Argyle went quiet for good. Today, if you know exactly where to look on that stretch of the Penobscot above Old Town, you can still find the old boom piers, or what the ice and the years have left of them, low humps of stone and rotted timber standing out in the river where the whole trade once passed. Most people who see them have no idea what they are looking at. A few of the old boom houses from the wider Penobscot system still stand upriver, kept now as small museums by people who refuse to let this be forgotten. But the great sorting works themselves, the 10 miles of piers and booms and pockets that did the actual job, are mostly just those stumps of stone in the water now. You could paddle a canoe right over the spot where the richest lumber trade on earth was sorted by hand, and never once know it. It is strange to me how completely this has dropped out of the story. The log drive itself, the men riding the timber down through the rapids, gets remembered and painted and set to music. The machine that caught everything they drove gets almost nothing, and I think it is because the boom did its work without any drama. There was never one wild day at the boom to build a legend around. There were just the same 126 piers standing in the same river, doing the same exacting work, every spring for 90 years. And take that quiet machine out of the river, and all the daring on the drive upstream adds up to nothing, because there is no way left to turn a mixed flood of logs back into owned, sorted, sellable timber. Here is what stays with me. We tend to think of sorting and counting and tracking a flood of goods as a modern problem, the kind of thing you solve with scanners and machinery and a warehouse full of computers. The men on the Penobscot solved it in the 1830s with axe marks, rock cribs, iron pins, rope, and their own eyes, out on the surface of a river in flood, and they solved it well enough to run the richest lumber trade on Earth for the better part of 100 years. So let me end on a claim you are welcome to fight me on in the comments. I do not believe there is a modern log yard or sorting operation anywhere that could match what the Argyle boom did for the money it cost, sorting an entire river down to the individual log, by hand, and then rebuilding the whole machine every spring after the ice had torn it down. The piers are still out there in the Penobscot, above Old Town, holding their line in the current. I think they earned a great deal more respect than the river ever gave them. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.